likes to have on.
Have fun.
Yes, and that'll keep, it'll just direct everyone's focus down here, quiet.
If there are any issues.
So, good evening, everybody. My name is Reshat Kasaba. I am the director of Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies, and on behalf of my colleagues and my students in the Jackson School, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation. I also want to say hello to our audience who's in the overflow room upstairs, and they're watching it from the screen, and hopefully they will be part of this conversation. There will be a question and answer after the talk. We have microphones on either side of the room. We ask you to come and ask your questions from those microphones. The overflow questions will be brought to me, and we will try to cover as many of those as we can. Professor Snyder will sign his books, his latest book, which is outside in the hallway, and after the lecture is finished, we will usher him outside and he will sign books there, and you can also continue your informal conversations with him for a little bit out there. I want to thank the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, Strom Center for Jewish Studies, Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian Studies, Center for West European Studies, Center for Global Studies, and also the Foster School's Global Business Center for their support. And if you look at all these entities who extended their support for this event, you get a sense of the reach that Timothy Snyder's name has and the interest that this lecture has provoked in our community. Timothy Snyder is the Levin Professor of History at Yale University. He is a member of the Committee on Conscience of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he is also a permanent fellow of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He is the author of Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, and also most recently, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America. And that is the book that will be available outside for purchase and for his signature. Among the many prizes and recognitions Professor Snyder has received, I would like to mention the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Hannah Arendt Prize, and also the Leipzig Book Award for European Understanding. In his research and writings, Timothy Snyder deals with some very dark periods and dark subjects. He deals with the destruction of East and Central Europe during World War II, with Holocaust and its significance for European and world history. But a main point that comes across from Professor Snyder's writing is that these horrible events of the 20th century resulted from the murderous desires and plans of individuals. And he has a very strong conviction that we all have a duty not only to understand these events, but also to resist the drift to chaos and tyranny whenever we see it, and reclaim our own history. History in Tim Snyder's hands then becomes not just a window to the past, but an important tool for managing our lives and shaping our future. And this is precisely why we in the Jackson School place so much emphasis on history in our teaching, research, and outreach. And this is why Tim Snyder is a perfect speaker for the Jackson School. I am very pleased to introduce Timothy Snyder, who will speak on 20 lessons from the 20th century.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So thank you all very much for being here. Thanks to you who are physically present. Thanks to you who are almost physically present. I'm glad to have you all here, or almost here, as the case may be. What I'd like to do in the next 45 minutes, hour or so, is talk to you about history. History, not in the sense of something which is a boring book that you have to read. And by the way, those of you who are here because you have to be from your history classes, a special welcome to y'all. By history, what I mean is not a book that you don't want to read or something that you put away. By history, I mean the thing that we are all in together. Unlike other disciplines, there is only one history. There's just one. There's only one set of human beings. That's us and the people we're descended from. There's only one set of written sources. All the written sources we have, all of history comes from those written sources. There's only one set. That's it. There's just one history. And so much of deciding to do good or to do evil in politics comes from recognizing whether or not you're in history. It comes from asking whether or not you're in history. That's why the first lesson of this book, this little book On Tyranny, which I'm talking about this evening, the first lesson of this book is don't obey in advance. Now, this lesson has everything to do with history. In the most straightforward sense, it's a lesson from history. It's a lesson from 1933. When we think of the rise of dictators like Adolf Hitler, who came to power in 1933, we can think of overpowering tyrants who, somehow with their superhuman powers immediately were able to control everyone. Images flash through our minds of salutes and marches and armies. But in fact, it's politics. And especially at the beginning, it's politics. And politics involves consent, especially at the beginning of authoritarian regime changes. And if you don't know what an authoritarian regime change feels like, I hope you will by the end of this lecture, because you're in one. At the nervous laughter. At the beginning, authoritarian regime changes depend upon consent. That is, they depend upon people normalizing the new reality and then meeting it halfway, anticipating what it's going to want, which is a normal human reaction. That's what we generally do in normal situations. So you're expected to sit down, you do. I'm expected to stand up and talk, I'm doing that. 99% of the time, it's normal to try to figure out what the social situation is and react to it. But in order to be a free person, you have to be able to define a situation as not being normal and to define for yourself what's normal. If every situation is normal to you, if you'll adapt to every situation, that means that you're not a free person, right? And the lesson of 1933 is precisely this, that if we don't think about it, if we just react, we'll react in the wrong way. We have to have an idea of not obeying in advance. And that idea comes from history. It comes from 1933. There's a politics to this. And the politics is the sooner you act, the better. The sooner you act, the better. There's a psychology to this, which is that if you decide at the beginning that you're going to say this is not normal, then you have a very good chance of doing something meaningfully later on. But if you decide at the beginning this is fine, it's very hard to go back from that. What you'll tend to do is psychologically keep doubling down on your earlier decision and say, well, I didn't do anything then, therefore this must be fine, and therefore you become a prisoner as things continue to get worse. Morally, if you don't resist at the beginning, then you become the person who didn't resist at the beginning, for yourself and for others, forever, right? So this is about history not just because it's a lesson from history, it's about history because it's a very good example of what history is. History is about structure and agency. It's about recognizing the limits of what you can and can't do. And once you recognize those limits, then you face the fact that you're responsible within those limits for what you do and what you don't do, right? It's so very easy to take part in ideas like, whatever I do doesn't make a difference, or everything's going to be fine, or everything's not going to be fine, regardless of what I do. That's a historical choice that you're making, right? Those ideas are very tempting. It's a little bit harder to say, I'm going to define for myself what's normal, what's not normal, and I'm going to act accordingly. That's the first lesson. The other reason why it's the first lesson in this book is that if you fail that one, the other 19 are totally irrelevant. That is to say, if you can't define for yourself what's normal and what's not normal, then you can't be a free person. And the other 19 lessons, beautiful as they might be in other ways, they're not going to be relevant to you, which doesn't mean that you can all leave now, like if I didn't reach you about number one. Lesson number two is protect institutions, defend institutions. And the reason why this is the second one is that it's a very fundamental political lesson in the American tradition and others, that it's the institutions that make us decent. We have a legend about ourselves and about how we defend freedom, which is that the last American, alone on some blasted heath, will be protecting us from the aliens or whatever it might be. Like, that's the image that we like. Or to bring it slightly more down to earth, Tiananmen Square in 1989, the lone young Chinese man, holding off the tank. But he actually got out of the way of that tank. By the time you get down to the one person defending against the onslaught, it's actually all over. That's not what freedom actually looks like. That's what Hollywood tells you freedom looks like. That's not what freedom actually looks like. Freedom requires institutions. And this is what the founders understood. The founders were not American exceptionalists. How could they be American exceptionalists? There was no America. They were trying to create America. And they were trying to create America on the basis of their understanding of human nature, which was, quite understandably, skeptical. They did not think that future generations of Americans would naturally, happily live within the Republic. On the contrary, they thought, we have to have institutions, like a legislature that checks an executive, like a judiciary that checks them both, like states that check the federal government and vice versa, precisely because we're not perfect. There's a great irony about the way that we look back at the Founding Fathers, the men we call the Founding Fathers. We look back at them as though they were demigods, right? As though their perfection somehow radiates outward towards us and makes us wonderful and exceptional. That would have horrified them, right? That would have horrified them, because their view was that they were flawed human beings and that future generations of Americans would be flawed human beings, and therefore we need the institutions. So the second lesson is defend institutions. And the reason why it's second, again, is that if we can't get to the institutions, it's very unlikely that we'll be able to do things on our own. Now, there's a historical point to this one, which I'm going to stay close to Germany in 1933. There are other examples too. The historical point is that when democracy goes away, it is, as I've already said, because people watch it go away and give their consent. It's also because institutions are gradually eroded. Even in the case of Nazi Germany, which might seem like a very dramatic case, before you get to Hitler, you have people bending the rules and breaking the rules. You have people governing by doing things which are not specifically forbidden, but which clearly are not in the spirit of the Constitution. And then, if you look at the 21st century, I'm not sure how many of you have spent that much time in the 21st century. Like, a lot of us have been looking at screens for a lot of it. But if you've been alive during the 21st century, and looking at screens doesn't count as being alive, by the way. If you've been alive during the 21st century, you might have noticed that it's been a terrible century for democracy. The last 12 years consecutively, according to Freedom House, which, by the way, is not some crazy left-leaning anti-American institution, but the last 12 years, actually, in a row, according to Freedom House, have seen decline in democracy around the world and rise in authoritarianism around the world. Right? And how does that happen? It happens step by step. It happens because of something that we now call backsliding. No one stands up one day and says, I've just had a coup d'etat or a revolution. People work step by step by step to change the institutions so that at some point, some imperceptible point, they can no longer defend themselves and people can no longer defend them. Now, the special thing for Americans, I try to be harder on Americans than anyone else because I think that's what being a patriot means. The special thing about being American is that you think that the institutions, either you don't care about the institutions, like you think, like we're special, we don't really need the institutions. That's one view. Like, government is bad, we'll be fine because we're Americans and we're great. Or the other view is, the institutions will protect us, right? So this view is wrong. This view is also wrong. The institutions won't protect us on their own. The institutions are only as good as the people who care about them, right? Who know what they are, who care about them, and actually try to make them work. It is oh so easy to fantasize, we don't need institutions. It's also very easy to say, well, the institutions are going to protect us. Every time somebody said that to me in November, December 2016, it took a day off my life, right? Which is why this might be my last lecture, because people said that a lot, as you might recall, and people are still saying it. it's not, you can't ask the institutions to defend you. You have to ask, what can I do for the institutions? Lesson number 3 is beware the one-party state. So those of you who are familiar with the history of the 20th century, when you think of the one-party state, you'll think of fascism or communism. You might think of Nazi Germany or of the Soviet Union. These were all one-party states. Now, the demons of our collective memory are all one-party states. But it's also true that in the 21st century, what tends to happen is that one-party states, now without particularly interesting ideologies, now without visions of the future, are also emerging around the world. What's wrong with a one-party state? What's the big deal with a one-party state? Well, there are 2 things that are wrong. The first is, as you slip from a multi-party system to a one-party system, what happens, and please tell me that you've noticed this because it's happening now. What happens is that one party stops competing on policy and starts betting on being able to change the institution so that it can't lose, right? That's what excuse me? Yeah, good, thank you. I'm going to count on you for the rest of the lessons too. I would like everyone to know that this gentleman and I have never met. So gerrymandering, right? Every way that you manipulate so that you're not competing on policy, but you're competing by fixing the system, that moves you towards a one-party state. In a multi-party system, we only have 2. I think it'd be better if we had more. But in a multi-party system, you have to compete on policy. The other reason why it's bad is obvious. In a one-party system, you won't meaningfully have democracy. And by the way, I'm just going to pause and I'm going to say that I think that democracy is a good thing, or rather that I think democracy in the United States would be a good thing, that democracy is a good thing and that it makes sense to try to make our system more democratic. And I think that's something which is worth saying, because I think it's very easy to say, oh, democracy, shemocracy, it's all the same thing, it doesn't matter, the same 7 oligarchs rule the world. Not yet, not yet they don't, right? Not yet they don't. So it's important to say democracy, if you believe it. I mean, if you guys want to charge the stage now because you think democracy is terrible, this is a good moment for that, actually. But no, not in this speech. I just mean in world history. You'll be on the side of history. But what's good about democracy, what's fundamentally good about democracy, is that it allows you to have a country. Because here's the thing about democracy. We all make mistakes. Remember what I said about the founders? We all make mistakes all the time. That's what it's like to be human, right? I mean, your girlfriend may tell you otherwise, before she breaks up with you, then she'll tell you the truth. But being human is about making mistakes all the time. What democracy does is that it converts our individual fallibility into a collective sense that as a society we're moving forward. Every 2 years or every 4 years, we elect people, we blame them for our own mistakes, in the confidence that we get to do it 2 years or 4 years again. The reason that seems so banal is that we take it for granted. The problem with a one-party state, or the problem with a dictatorship which is associated with one person, is that you lose track of the future. You don't know what's going to happen next. And that uncertainty affects and undermines everything, right? So democracy is good for many reasons, but one reason democracy is a good thing is it allows you to know that the United States of America or some other country is going to continue to exist, that you will be voting, or your children, in the same country your parents did, or your children will be voting in the same country that you did. Okay. Lesson number 4 is take responsibility for the fate of the world. Sorry, that's too much. Just for the face of the world. Take responsibility for the face of the world. What does this mean? By the face of the world, I mean just literally the 3-dimensional world. One of the things that we understand about 1933, again, I'm going to stay close to Hitler's takeover, is that it matters a lot whether you paint a swastika on the wall or not. And it matters a lot whether other people allow that swastika to stay on the wall. What's visible becomes thinkable, and what's thinkable becomes doable, right? And so it matters a great deal in the United States of America in 2018 whether you paint swastikas on the wall and whether your friends allow them to stay on the wall. Because what's visible becomes thinkable, and what's thinkable becomes doable. Now, in the 20th century, this was a lesson which was entirely about the 3-dimensional world, because that's where we lived. In the 21st century, this is also a lesson about the internet. We spend a lot of time in a different space. And one of our problems is we don't think about it as a space. We think about it as a kind of exception where the rules don't apply. One of our problems, and one of the things that I think bit us pretty hard in 2016, was that we were very careless about how we were treating that space. I'm going to say more about this later in the lecture, but I just like to drop this idea now that the internet is a space that we all have to share. Each of us has a certain amount of responsibility for the trace that we leave in the internet. We should be thoughtful about how we treat it, because it's a kind of environment which we share with everyone, and the things we do in the internet really have consequences. Okay, number 5 is remember professional ethics. Okay, ho-hum, professional ethics. What's a concentration camp? A concentration camp is a place where businessmen go for cheap labor. Concentration camp is a place where, which is run by lawyers. A concentration camp is a place that only exists because bureaucrats make exceptions to rules. A concentration camp is a place where doctors carry out experiments. That's what a concentration camp is. A concentration camp is not possible without people from multiple professions violating professional ethics. What's a show trial? A show trial requires judges, prosecutors, defense lawyers, all of them to play a role, all of them to abandon the basic tenets of professional ethics. It's extremely hard to get to those totalitarian extremes of concentration camps and show trials if people have some sense of professional ethics. Professional ethics set bounds on what's acceptable and what's not. And also professional ethics connect you to a community like doctors or lawyers, or for that matter, civil servants who can have some kind of a code and who can help one another feel like they're not alone in this, right? That we should take some kind of a stand about this. And it's interesting, by the way, in America right now, that there are very, very many, especially doctors and lawyers, who are looking back at the way doctors and lawyers behaved in Germany in the 1930s and drawing lessons from that, which strikes me as being a very good thing. Now, the primary professional ethic, or the professional ethic that the fundamental professional ethic that goes away when the others aren't respected, is the rule of law, right? So going back to my examples, a concentration camp, the technical definition of a concentration camp is a place where the law does not apply. That's a concentration camp. A show trial is a public spectacle where the law is perverted. The fundamental professional ethic is the rule of law, right? And that's I think, the right way for us to be thinking, for example, about the Mueller investigation. The Mueller investigation is not some kind of spectacle where, like, Mueller faces up against Trump. The Mueller investigation is a question of whether we as a society, and it's a question, are still going to be able to function in terms of the rule of law or not. Which brings me to lesson 6 and lesson 7, which I'm going to talk about together, which are be wary of paramilitaries and be reflective if you must be armed. So I'm going to tell you how these lessons work together, and I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by being reflective. So be wary of paramilitaries, be reflective if you must be armed. Why is that so important? Because in a rule of law state like Germany was and ceased to be, and like we are, but we're hovering, in a rule of law state, the government has a monopoly on legitimate violence. Like, that's what government means, is the government has a monopoly on legitimate violence. If you want to get rid of a rule of law state, there are 2 ways to go about it. One is that you invite paramilitaries, that is, people who are not part of the government, you invite them to perform acts of violence in public, because that undermines everyone's confidence in law and in security. It makes them doubt that things like democracy can possibly work. They ask for a strongman, and so on and so forth. The other thing you can do is you can take the forces of law and order, like the police, and you can change them. You can invite them to do things which aren't really about enforcing law anymore. And so, for example, in the case of Nazi Germany, to give a drastic example, who shot the most people in the Holocaust? The regular policemen. The regular policemen, not the SS, the regular policemen. So what was special about the Nazi German state was that it did both of these things. It brought paramilitaries, called the SS and the SA, into the state, and it brought the police, and also the army to some extent, closer to the SS. So that by the time the Second World War began in 1939, there was one pyramid of power, which was a kind of hybrid, where the SS and the police were all mixed up together, and they became what Himmler called racial warriors. Now, I want to give you an example of being reflective, because I like it so very much, and it comes from Mr. Smiles, who's the policeman standing outside the door right now. As I went out there to wait because I couldn't deal with all the flashbulbs in here. So I was standing out there and I was listening to Mr. Smiles talk to his colleague, and this is what he said, which struck me as amazing. I want to share it. He said, he's pointing to this crowd, he's pointing to the audience, and he said, this is where the magic happens. Academia, research. We've lost sight of that, especially in this administration. I thought, wow, that's pretty reflective. So anyway, there's a lovely example out there right now. You can say hi to him on your way out. Okay, and that goes very nicely into the next lesson, which is stand out. So stand out is like number one, don't obey in advance. It sounds easy and it's actually really hard, or it sounds simple, but it's actually pretty psychically complicated. Stand out is about freedom. So what does it mean to be free? It doesn't mean you talk about freedom a lot. I mean, let's face it, that would be a little bit too easy. And that's the American way. You talk about freedom a lot, you talk about liberty a lot. But what does it actually mean to be free? I mean, can it possibly be as simple as just talking about it? I don't think so. There was a Polish poet who won the Nobel Prize called Wisława Szymborska, who said, wrote in a poem, it's called The World Through a Grain of Sand, we know ourselves only insofar as we have been tested, right? So just talking about it is probably not the thing. Is it free? Are you free? Here's another thing which bothers me. Are you free if you're afraid of the same things as the person next to you? Is that freedom? I worry about this a lot. So, I mean, I'll pick on my own demographic. White men, when they think about violence, they think about Muslims and blacks. But if you're a white man and you're going to be killed by violence in this country, it's almost going to be certainly by another white man. But that's not what we think of, right? And why is that? If you're afraid of the same thing as the person next to you, maybe that's a suggestion that you're not free? Maybe that's a suggestion that you've been successfully profiled and manipulated, right? If you have the same fears as people who look like you, isn't that a sign that perhaps you're not free because you're not figuring things out for yourself? I mean, the test of freedom that I give in 8, stand out, it's very simple, but it's, I think, deceptively simple. Do you feel uncomfortable? Because the thing about an act of freedom, I think, is that you're always going to feel uncomfortable because you're always going to be doing something which is against the drift of what's going on around you. And that always feels a little bit strange. So that's a kind of daily test. Did it feel strange today, or was I just with everyone else? If you were just with everyone else, then there's reason, I think, to worry. And of course, there's power in that feeling of discomfort, because if you're willing to feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you're working from a place of relative privilege, if you're willing to feel a little bit uncomfortable, that makes it a little bit easier for the person next to you to feel a little bit uncomfortable. And in that way, people help one another to be free. It seems to me this is a very important lesson for a lot of us right now, because most of us right now, not all of us, I know, but most of us right now in this country are not facing very much risk. We could make little gestures all the time, and the thing which holds us back is usually ourselves, the sense that we don't want to stand out too much. We don't want to say something that sounds like it's a little crazy. We don't want to feel like other people might make fun of us for being free. But being free involves people making fun of you. It always does. If no one's saying that's a little strange or that's a little weird or what are you doing, you're probably not a free person. Number 9, be kind to our language. Number 10, believe in truth. Number 11, investigate. I'm going to talk about these together. So I think that the facts have a very profound connection to freedom. If in order to be free, you have to be able to defend yourself against power And what do you defend yourself against power with? You defend yourself against power with the real world. That is, you can defend yourself against power if you can talk about things that are happening in the real world in a way that will allow you to create allies, build alliances, get other people to think that maybe you're right. If you start from the position, there is no real world, there's no factuality, everything's a matter of opinion, how on earth can you function politically? You can't. How on earth can you win against power? If you say there's no truth, power will also say, yes, there's no truth. And power will always have a better spectacle than you. And then you will win. Power has a better spectacle than you. That's the United States in 2018. It has a better spectacle. What it doesn't have are facts, right? That's what it doesn't have. Facts are weapons of the weak, but hint, weapons of the weak are better than no weapons at all, right? Weapons of the weak are better than conceding everything to the strong. If you concede that there are no facts, that there's no real world, you're conceding everything to the strong right at the outset, because they will always have a better spectacle. They will always have the spectacle. Now, something else I want to say about this is that this position, okay, there's a position of total doubt, that I'm skeptical about this. I know I'm skeptical of Fox News, and I'm skeptical of ESPN, and I'm skeptical of the deans of my university, and I'm skeptical of mom and dad, and I'm skeptical of everything. That's a very easy position. And that position of total skepticism blends into total naivete. Because if you don't believe in anything, if that's your pose, if you don't believe in anything, the one thing that you're going to believe in is the thing that makes you feel good. And that's how you lose. Because the people who are smarter than you, for example, on the internet, don't have very much trouble figuring out what makes you feel good and giving that thing to you, right? So when you doubt everything, all that's left is the stuff that pleases you, that affirms you. That's all that's left. And then you're very, very, very disempowered, right? So that pose of total cynicism, which I realize feels kind of cool, that pose of total cynicism is actually totally disempowering. And here comes my word to the young. Okay. This pose of being skeptical about everything, that might have been cool in the 1990s when I was young. But I think it has aged itself out by now. Okay? What has happened since the 1980s is that the cool pose of the 1990s has then been taken over by Russian oligarchs who are now selling it back to you. I really think we need to get through this. I think that the young people have to valorize the real world, right? Have to make the real world interesting, have to make investigation cool. I can't figure out how to do this, and frankly, I don't think it's my job. I think it's the job of you. Because if another generation comes along and says, we doubt everything, that's just, there's just something, I'm sorry, there's something sad about that. That was already done. That was the 1990s. That's already happened, right? You guys need to do something different. And the thing that's different, which would help our republic a lot, would be that if you guys could figure out how to make the real world, factuality, sexy. That would be a good thing. Okay, I'm just going to lay that in front of you, and take it where you will. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to say about this is that, so I'm not joking about the internet, by the way. So there are reasons to be concerned that the internet, that the way we should be thinking about the internet is that it is basically authoritarian as opposed to basically enlightening. Why would we think that? Aside from the fact that the spread of the internet has coincided with the spread of authoritarianism around the world, right? And then people say, well, there's some good news from Africa about democracy. That's right, and Africa is the continent with the lowest internet penetration, right? Why is it that the generation which was raised in the internet is the generation which is least interested in democracy and most supports government by strongmen? I don't think there's any particular reason to think that the internet is helping democracy. On the contrary, I think there are great reasons to worry about it, or in particular reasons to worry about how we use it, because at the end of the day, it comes down to us how we choose to use it. But the thing which is most troubling about it in recent times is the way that the internet helps us to define an us and a them, and it helps us to define an us and a them entirely within our own country. So if you think back to the election of 2016, there are a lot of things to say about it, but one thing I think it's fair to conclude is that basically nobody in the United States in 2016 was thinking about any other countries at all. If you, a quantitative study of major television news was done, which found out that the candidates were talking about foreign countries less than 1% of the time, right? And if you remove get along with Putin, get along with Putin, get along with Putin, it goes down to 0% on one side. But people weren't talking about other countries. We were only talking about ourselves, right? And we were talking about ourselves as enemies, as enemies. The Russian social bots on election day 2016 were firing under what hashtag? And I'm sure some of you saw it in your own Twitter feeds. They were firing under the hashtag war against Democrats. Did it even occur to anyone that that was a foreign country doing that? No, because it was pretty much normal that we were thinking about making war against one another. That's a consequence. I mean, it's our fault, but that's a consequence also of how the technology can be made to work. I mean, in the strange, and this is something I write about at length in Road to Unfreedom, I can't spell it all out here, but it's a very striking fact that in 2016, the United States of America managed to lose the first major cyber war in history by allowing a foreign state to choose its president. That's remarkable. But what's more remarkable is that we didn't even notice while it was happening, right? And this goes to a fundamental question about what war actually is. When you think of war and you think of combat, that's not actually what war is. Clausewitz, who is the leading student of war, the leading theorist of war, says that war is altering the enemy's will so that the enemy does what you want. Combat isn't war, combat is a means to an end. What if, and this is what Russian military doctrine has said since 2013, what if you can break the enemy's will or bend the enemy's will without combat? What if you can do it entirely over the internet? What if you can have a cyber budget which costs less than one American F-35 and change the American presidential election? What if, right? It's not a what if. That actually happened. And one of the reasons why it happened was in 2016, we were so unable to think ourselves back into the real world and so trapped, too many of us. And I don't have to recite all of this, right? Like you all know that on Facebook, the top 20 fake stories were more widely read than the top 20 news stories in the 6 weeks before the election. We all know this, right? We all know that there were bot campaigns, some Russian, some not Russian, targeted at voters in sensitive states right at the last minute. We all know that these things actually took place. The odd thing is that this could happen without us noticing it. And I'm just going to close on this, but it'd be odder still if we managed not to notice now that we lost a war. Because countries only learn from war, and they only learn when they realize they've lost a war. It's not that America never loses wars. We've lost a whole number in my lifetime, but America's very bad at recognizing that it's lost wars. Would be a good time for reflection, right? Because only if you realize what's happened to you do you have a chance to reflect upon it. Okay, that's enough for those lessons. So number 12, 13, 14. 12 is make eye contact and small talk. 13, practice corporeal politics. 14, establish a private life. So I've already dwelled on this. Democracy happens in the real world, right? There has never been a democracy which hasn't involved physical space. Democracy begins with the Greeks in the real world. The average American spends 11 hours a day in front of a screen, right? Which is a terrifying figure, and like to all of you who are not looking at screens right now, like thank you for improving the average. To those of you who are, okay. I have this idea that if it weren't 11 hours but 10 hours and 15 minutes, the outcome of the election probably would have been different. I mean, just imagine that we could somehow get it down from 11 hours to 9 hours, right? How much that would change things. But the point of these lessons is that there are certain things that happen in the real world in 3 dimensions that don't actually happen over the internet. So, I mean, those of you guys know what Facebook is? It's something that, no, it's a serious question, because it's mainly something that middle-aged people use to hemorrhage data. But no, that's what it is. That's the Facebook business model. But I imagine some of you young folks have heard of it. Anyway, so the thing about Facebook or other platforms is that what never happens on Facebook is that anyone convinces anyone, right? There have been quintillions of interactions on Facebook, and not a single one of them has been, you have convinced me with your rational arguments. Right? That has never happened, right? Isn't that interesting that that has never happened? It's not that it's easy to convince people in the real world. It's hard to convince people in the real world, but at least you have some kind of a chance. And also, at least you know you're talking to someone, right? Like, I'm glad that I'm talking to you, like when you smile, when you don't smile, when you talk to your friend. I like that because I know you're not a bot, right? Or if you are a really, really good bot. But yeah, there you go. All right. See, I'm just pretty sure you're not, right? That thing you just did, like that could only, he made a joke, camera. He made a physical joke, which you didn't catch. It was perfectly clean and suitable for children. There's like, you have a fan base out there. I just need to make sure that you get to your fan base. The point is that there are things that happen in the real world that don't happen over the internet. One of them is the serendipity of physical contact. When you go on marches, you meet people that you wouldn't meet otherwise, and you make plans that you wouldn't have met otherwise. It's not an accident that so many of the people who are running for office now in the US started out by going on a march, right? Things happen in the real world that don't happen in other places. That's what I mean by corporeal politics. Also, this seems simple, but you just feel better. Like if the politics that you undertake actually gets you away from the screen and out with other people, it's a little frightening at first. But at the end of it, you feel better. So many of us, will spend the day on Facebook, whatever platform, do absolutely nothing, feel like we did something, and at the end of the day, you feel tired and lonely, right? Whereas if you actually meet with people, then you tend to feel better. The other thing about this is that we're a very polarized society, right? Extremely polarized, and that's a very big problem for democracy, the polarization. But the polarization is largely virtual rather than real. That is to say, people do disagree about things profoundly in this country, right? About abortion, gun control, I know. But since so much of the discussion takes place on the internet, the other side isn't real, right? The other side is presented as basically as demons. So people treat the other side. So instead of having a discussion, not that we have to agree, but instead of having a discussion, what happens is that you're presented with the other side in this kind of drastic parody form. And the same goes, by the way, for issues like immigration or Muslims, right? The people who are most afraid of Muslims in this country and in Europe are the people who don't see them. The people who are most afraid of immigrants are the people who live in places where there are no immigrants, which at first seems like a puzzle. But the answer is they are in fact in touch with Muslims and immigrants, but they're in touch with the image of Muslims and immigrants that the internet gives to them, right? So polarization is real, but it's made radically worse by the internet. If you were in contact with real people, radical polarization becomes much less likely. Okay, number 15 is a light one. Contribute to good causes. So this goes to the question which we were talking about at dinner. Like, what do we actually do? The things that we have to do would be things where we know something about the issue, we care about the issue gets us in touch with real people in the real world, and we can keep at it every day. That's the trick. The way authoritarianism works, especially in our postmodern world, is that it bombards you with bad news all the time. It makes you feel overwhelmed, and you think, what can I do about all this? I mean, how can I fix North Korea and Syria and the EPA and the Commerce Department, and how can I get Melania another job? It's overwhelming, right? But see, the mistake here is none of us has to fix everything. We're not Superman. Like, none of us has to fix everything. If each of us consistently works on some small part of it, that would actually be enough. Consistently, right? So the trick is to keep at it day after day, even if the news cycle makes you feel bad. And there's a trick to making the news cycle not make you feel bad, which is to watch the news less, right? Because it's actually way more important that you're out in the real world doing your little bit of good than it is that you hear, Fox and Friends that morning. And we spend a lot of time watching these televised talk shows, or at least some people do. I'm looking at I don't know, where is he? Okay. A lot of us spend time watching these, but it doesn't, if you miss it for 4 days, it actually doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. But if you don't do your little good thing for 4 days, that matters a lot in the world, right? But this lesson, Contribute to Good Causes, it's a very simple one. It just says, pick a charity and contribute to it on autopay. So that time, on those days when you really do feel bad and don't do anything, you can at least feel like I'm helping other people do something, right? And that may seem really simple, like subscribing to newspapers, you know? I'm not going to ask you because like camera's on, it's kind of embarrassing, but we should really all be subscribing to the newspapers that we read. We should all do that. It makes a huge difference, and it only costs $25, $30 a year. And if you're a student, there are special rates. It really doesn't cost very much, and it makes a huge difference. So if everybody puts one charity on autopay, we're not going to notice it, those of us who have money, right? I'm not asking everyone to do this, but those of us who have money, we'll put one charity on autopay, everybody, right? It makes a huge difference. Right now what we do is like the ACLU gets a huge amount of money in bursts. Okay, that's great. But what if we all, did this? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm beating that point to the ground. Number 16. Learn from peers in other countries. So there's this question like, can it happen here? That is a dumb question because there is no here. There isn't a here. There's an it, but there's no here. There's nothing magical about America, which means that democracy has to thrive here and not other places. There's no here. There's an it. The transition to authoritarian rule, that's true, that's real, that's happening all over the world. But it's happening as one phenomenon. It's connected. What happens in Russia and Turkey and India and Poland and Hungary is connected to what happens to America. It's all one phenomenon, right? And therefore, one of the best ways to get out in front of what's happening is to listen to people from India or Turkey or Poland or Russia or Ukraine who have tried to do something, because they will be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead of you in experience. And that can be really useful. Now, that is totally not the American way, right? The American way is to say, we've got a great democracy and let us tell you how to build one, right? And here's a tank. That's the American way. But in terms of being real, in terms of seeing the world for the way it's actually working, what's happening is that these trends that we observe in the United States actually appear in other countries first. And in the case of Russia, are actively exported back to us, which means that if you followed Russia in 2010, 2011, you'd have a pretty good chance of knowing what was going to happen in the US in 2015, 2016. It's actually startling to what extent events in Russia prepare us, if we'd been paying attention, for events in the United States. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, to which we paid all too little attention, in many ways was a rehearsal of, or even an element of, the campaign which Russia is carrying out against the United States of America. Right down to the details. The same social bots were used, the same propaganda tactics were used, the same malware is in the Ukrainian power grid as is in our power grid. In 2014, they tried to hack the Ukrainian election. 2016, they succeeded in hacking ours. So the learning from peers in other countries is very good because it's humbling and it's also extremely helpful. Now, I'll just give you one example of this. In April of 2016, I wrote the first article of what is now known as the Russia story. I was the person who broke that story in the United States. Why was that? Because I wasn't living mentally in the US, I was living mentally in Russia and Ukraine. And if you were following the Russian press, it was totally obvious that the elites of the Russian Federation were supporting a candidate, not for the presidency at that point, for the Republican nomination, right? They hadn't even been the conventions yet. So if you're paying attention to other places, then sometimes things become clear that aren't clear here. Who predicted that Trump would win in this country? African Americans. And who else? Russian journalists, Ukrainian journalists, because they'd seen this kind of thing happen before, right? Who, when they looked at Brexit in 2016, thought that Brexit was going to pass? Russians and Ukrainians, right? Because they'd seen this kind of thing happen before. Okay, number 17, number 18. Listen for dangerous words. Be calm when the unthinkable arrives. So these are lessons about a particularly critical moment when a leader is able to push a republic into an authoritarian state, where a leader takes advantage of something that maybe really happens, like a terrorist attack, for example, or a war, takes advantage of that moment to change the system, right? And the way that this happens, it has two steps. In the first step, the leader primes you to think that the enemies are mainly at home, right? So the leader talks about, blacks as sons of bitches, or establishes a denunciation office for Mexican immigrants, or changes an office of the investigation of terrorism into an office of investigation of Islamic terrorism, just to take three true examples from our own country in the last few months. The leader instructs you how the enemy is actually at home until you get used to that idea. Then when something happens, the leader asks you to accept a state of emergency. And that state of emergency, where you give up your civil rights, because you feel like you have to, because there's fear and there's grief and so on, that then becomes permanent. This is page 3 of the Dictator's Playbook. Page 1 and 2 are filled with attractive illustrations. This is page 3 of the Dictator's Playbook. When the prototype is the Reichstag fire in Nazi Germany of 1933. When the German parliament burns, no one knows who actually did it, doesn't matter. Hitler is able to blame his enemies on the left, and from that point forward, there is no longer the rule of law in Germany. Hitler asks for a temporary suspension of the civil rights and constitutional rights of Germans, and that temporary condition becomes permanent. Right? This is the way it works, and here's the thing. Every aspiring dictator knows this, and every person who advises authoritarian rulers knows this. Something happened very similar to this in Russia in 1999. Something happened very similar to this in Turkey 2 summers ago. Everybody knows that this is the playbook, which means that if you want to keep your republic, you have to know yourself that this is the playbook, and you have to talk about it and think about it in advance. So when something happens, when the unthinkable arrives, you don't give in to your impulse to say, yes, I'm afraid, I need a leader. Yes, I'm grieving. I'm happy to give up my rights. You have to think, I'm afraid, that's normal. I'm grieving, that's human. But it's precisely now that I need to protect my rights, because it's precisely now that my rights are at their most vulnerable. Those are lessons 17 and 18. I'm going to leave number 20 to you. I'm going to finish with number 19, which is be a patriot. So what I had in mind with patriotism is something very specific. I'll be back. I'm sure you thought it was going to be something much more exciting than a little book. What I have in mind by patriotism is something very simple, that loving your country involves imagining your country according to the principles which itself claims to uphold. That there's a difference between nationalism, which is easy, oh so easy, and patriotism, which is hard. It's easy to be a nationalist. To be a nationalist, all I have to do is say, you Americans are wonderful, everything is great, right? And who doesn't want to hear that? Who doesn't want to hear that, honestly? To be a patriot, you have to say, the United States of America, or whatever my country is, the United States of America has principles, and partaking in the United States of America means inching it towards those principles. That's hard. That's hard, but it's also citizenship, right? Nationalism is disempowering. If I tell you that what you're doing already, everything is fine, that is how I take power from you. If you believe instead that it's your job as a citizen not to obey in advance, try to defend factuality, think of the little things you can do day to day to expand civil society, then I can't rule you. Maybe I can govern you, but I can't rule you. Authoritarian regime change is then impossible, right? Patriotism in that sense. So I'm going to read you a couple lines from this, and then I'll be done. So, patriotism and nationalism. A nationalist encourages us to be our worst, and then tells us that we are the best. A nationalist, although endlessly brooding on power, victory, defeat, revenge, wrote George Orwell, tends to be uninterested in what happens in the real world. Nationalism is relativist, since the only truth is the resentment we feel when we contemplate others. As the novelist Danilo Kish put it, nationalism has no universal values, aesthetic or ethical. A patriot, by contrast, wants the nation to live up to its ideals, which means asking us to be our best selves. A patriot must be concerned with the real world, which is the only place where his country can be loved and sustained. A patriot has universal values, standards by which he judges his nation, always wishing it well and wishing that it would do better. Democracy failed in Europe in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and it is failing not only in much of Europe, but in many parts of the world today. It is that history and experience that reveals to us the dark range of our possible futures. A nationalist will say, it can't happen here, which is the first step toward disaster. A patriot says, it could happen here, but that we will stop it. Thank you.
So we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. We're going to ask you to come to either microphone, and please make sure that what you state is a question. And so we'll try to cover as many of your questions as possible. Yes, please.
Yeah, and I'd like to strongly encourage students to ask questions, please. And I don't just mean like students of life, right? I mean like,
Please.
hey.
Now mine is on.
There we go. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'm still not entirely sure how I want to phrase this, but one of your first lessons or points was to stand out and to exercise your own viewpoint. And I'm still kind of grappling with, I guess, how much of that is a good thing when also, you know, how much opportunity do we give to people to flaunt ideas that we might call not normal, and how much kind of leeway do we give ourselves to let everyone engage, even if we don't disagree with their ideas, and then perhaps normalize things that are kind of on the margin. So how much, what's the balance, I guess, between allowing people to stand out and to put their ideas out there, but also not normalize things that are too extreme?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thanks for the question. It's very clarifying. Stand out in the book is primarily addressed to you. So it's not about thinking about what other people do. It's about asking whether you yourself are willing to do something which is slightly unpopular, whether you yourself are willing to say the thing which you know is going to have the cost of making you feel a little bit strange. The assumption is you're doing it with some good motive, right? So in Stand Out, we're assuming that, I'm going to get to your question, but we're assuming in that lesson that we have some good motives, but we lack just the tiniest bit of courage which would allow us to put them through, and hence the lesson, right? So Stand Out is not asking us to have anything particularly advanced or interesting to say. It's just asking us to say that thing we know is probably a good thing, but is going to make us feel a little bit strange. So your question is a little bit different because it's about judging other people's opinions. And what I would say there is that opinions that are very controversial are usually super easy, right? Precisely because they're controversial. Like, if you know that people are going to be outraged by what you say, that's actually easy. I mean, that's not what I think of as freedom, because it's just, you're playing on what you know other people. So if I say what everybody thinks, that's easy. If I say something that outrages other people, that's also easy. In neither case am I doing anything which is of very much use. So I think the question of like what opinions go too far is a different question, because the opinions that go too far are often very easy, right? They're often things that people find very easy to say. So I mean, you're asking a different question, which is an important question, which is about the public sphere, right? And I tend to think that the public sphere has to be rehumanized, not so much by taboos. I mean, this is an issue which touches universities and lots of other places, what it's okay to say and what's not okay to say. I think a lot of it comes down to what can we actually say to each other in person? Because a lot of these debates, like, they end up happening half on the internet and half cyber and half real. Like, somebody said something in California and I'm going to debate in Connecticut, or vice versa. I think the question of what's acceptable is a lot easier to handle when people are actually doing it face to face, right? About African American history, which is one that has been, very troublesome at Yale. A lot of it hangs on whether people actually can talk about it face to face or whether they're trying each other in the media. So that's about as much as I have to say about that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I wonder, in regards to Armenia and the events that happened there this week, whether this might be the beginning of a spring movement in Europe, with the rallying of people to insist that the president who was seeking to become the prime minister and thereby extend his term, much like Putin has done over and over again, and he was just ousted essentially, and finally stepped down. So
Yeah.
I'd like your thoughts on that in terms of the how much influence this could possibly have in the other countries.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to make a very general point, which is that when I was talking about corporeal politics, I mean, what I mean by corporeal politics is politics which involves you putting your body somewhere. It seems a very simple idea, but a lot of what we do that we think is political involves us sitting somewhere. Corporeal politics means I'm willing to go to somebody else's house. I'm willing to go on a march. I'm willing to put my body somewhere. I'm willing to meet people who I didn't know before. I'm willing to go to some part of the city I don't ordinarily go to, right? And one of the things I didn't say about corporeal politics, which your question gets to, is that it works. I mean, not all the time, but it's actually quite effective. Civil resistance, I mean, the social science of this is pretty convincing that civil resistance rather often works. At a certain stage, and past a certain stage, it's not going to work. But up to a pretty far along in the authoritarian regime change, civil resistance makes a great deal of difference. And so when people ask, should I march or not? Often what they say is, well, it doesn't matter whether I do. And the funny thing is, it actually matters a huge amount whether you do march or not. Like, just in terms of the cold, hard social science of it, it matters a huge amount whether you march. Which doesn't mean you always win all the time, but Armenia, but also a few weeks before that, Slovakia, where a couple of journalists were murdered. This actually led a lot of people, interestingly, young people, to get out and march and protest in large numbers, which then has changed the political situation. So in each individual case, I didn't want to mark and say all of our hopes rise and fall on Armenia or Slovakia, but I would want to say that these examples show that it actually does matter. That when these moments happen where something has taken place which is just unacceptable, like this guy's going to rule forever, or our journalists are going to be murdered, when some kind of line has been crossed, you do have to get out and march, even if you're not entirely sure with whom or where's it going to start. The default has to be that means we get out on the streets, right? Like, for example, if Robert Mueller is fired, right? Like, you got to get out and march, right? If you're in favor of okay.
So we have one question from our overflow room. How does the public opinion evidenced in the Me Too and Black Lives Matter activism illustrate concepts from On Tyranny?
Well, I think activists should be allowed to speak for themselves, and it wouldn't be. I wouldn't want to try to explain how other people's actions exemplify, the ideas from the thinkers that appear in On Tyranny. But I would note I would note a couple of things that are important. That I'll just note one that I think is important to both of them, which is factuality. So Black Lives Matter starts with noticing how many African Americans are treated unfairly or at the extreme killed, right? That's a kind of factual basis for politics. And then Me Too starts with individual women describing factual, the act of courage is describing factual things which happen to oneself, right? But it's based upon the fact, right? In that way, it's the kind of thing that I'm talking about in lessons 9, 10, 11. But I don't want to push this too far because I don't want to speak for, I don't want to speak for other people's movements, right?
Hi. Of the many startling things you said in your talk, one of the things that struck me the most was the idea that Russia is somehow 5 or 6 years ahead of us, and we can kind of use them to prognosticate, particularly given the results of the recent election, in contrast to the mass protests of 2011, 2012, against Putin. There seemed to have been virtually nothing in comparison.
Here?
No,
or
in Russia.
In Russia, yeah.
Right, and I guess I'm wondering like how you read that. Was there a sense of exhaustion? And also when you talked about concentration camps, it also reminded me of the things that we'll tolerate, I guess, even in our own society, even before the advent of Trump, and that is, of course, Guantanamo and kind of, the human rights disaster of that place. Yeah.
So let me say a couple broad things about Russia. So in this talk, I was talking about the little political pamphlet On Tyranny. The big fat book, like some people like little books, some people like big books. The big fat book, Road to Unfreedom, is all about this. And I only brushed across some of the things in that book tonight. But Russia as, I think flipping things around and just starting from the perspective that Russia's ahead of us in certain ways is really intellectually useful. Partly because I think it gives you some insight into what the Russians themselves think they're doing, which is they're pulling us towards themselves. It's not like they have a great vision of like America becoming X or Y or Z. They just want things to function less well here. And that's it. And that would be a lot.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, well, no. Things still, they're functioning much less well here than a year ago, but it's still not like Russia, so there's still a lot of work to be done, right? And that work is being done by bots in the neighborhood near you right now. So that it helps you see what Russians think themselves they're up to. The second thing, which is one other way to think about it, is if you're going to do a structural analysis, which is part of what I do in the book. Wealth inequality has dramatic effects on politics. And what Russia has done is it's shown how you can stabilize wealth inequality and still get by, at least for a while. According to Credit Suisse, which is not some kind of crazy left-wing institution, but rather a Swiss bank, according to Credit Suisse, Russia has the highest rates of wealth inequality in the world, and we're number 2. And that itself is that's worth thinking about, because what they've gotten to is a point where a single oligarchical clan has stayed on top largely by way of a politics of spectacle and by way of a politics of defining yourself as alone in the world where everyone else is out to get you. Now, we're not there yet, but we're certainly taking steps in that direction, right? There's certainly not one oligarchical clan that controls America, but there are certain last names, which are appearing more and more often in the news, like Koch and Mercer and Trump, and so we are moving in this direction. And the politics of spectacle, of course, we've gotten much closer to that, right, with the daily presidential tweets and the way that news is covered. So that Russia also helps us to see where you can go. Now, in terms of Russia itself, the fundamental problem this is why I was dwelling on democracy. The fundamental problem at the heart of all this is that what Russia's doing is not actually that much fun for Russians. It's not actually that much fun for Russian leaders. Deep down, they all know that Putin's going to die, right? Even Putin presumably knows that. And he's not 20 and he doesn't live in Silicon Valley, right? If you're 20 and live in Silicon Valley, you think you're going to live forever. But if you're, okay. No, it's true. You do. I've heard them say it. Okay. But what I think the deep, dark problem in Russia is the problem of succession. And because they don't know what's going to come next, they have to divert everything outwards. Ukraine, Syria, the EU, the United States. And that, that's a kind of syndrome of big, powerful countries that don't know what's going to come next. And that's another argument that I try to develop in the book. As for the 2018 versus 2011, it goes back to the next question. I mean, it's just a lot harder to protest in Russia now than it was 6 years ago. You let things go too far, and it's hard to protest. But notice what happened. I mean, just a little micro lesson. I'm sure you already know this, given what you've said. But when Russians protested, what did Putin say? He said, they're agents of foreign powers and they're paid, right? Basically everything that Mr. Trump says has been said in a sentence with fewer words by Mr. Putin. That's like an iron rule of, and the amazing thing is, I don't know who translates it, but this whole idea that protesters are paid and that they like that's straight out of what Mr. Putin says. Okay, I'm gonna. You're not satisfied? There's more?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
Very quickly, thank you for your books. Thank you for the 20 points. In particular, thank you for the arguing for the study of foreign countries, which is the heart and soul of the Jackson School here at the university. Thank you for mentioning Ukraine, and now the reality check. This is one of few universities in this country to teach Ukrainian, and out of 45,000 students, 4 are trying to learn Ukrainian, and the numbers are not better for Russian or Hindi or Kazakh or Turkish. If they're listening to you, thank you for speaking to students too. If they're listening to you, what do you tell them about the study of foreign languages, of non-English languages?
Yeah, so I'm going to take that a little bit broader. It's a funny thing, but English being the world language is actually a source of not just strength but weakness for us, because it doesn't occur to us that other people using English might be out to get us. So for example, I mean, the Heart of Texas, anybody follow Heart of Texas? You don't have to admit it now. Heart of Texas was a Russian social media site, series of activities, Instagram and Facebook. Heart of Texas, the Facebook version, had 10 times more followers than the Texas Republican Party. Heart of Texas was a pro-Texas secession site, which was also an anti-Hillary site, and it spread all fantastic rumors that you could think of. It was also followed on Twitter by a number of important people in the campaign of Mr. Trump. And the thing I'm going for is that Heart of Texas was run by Russians whose English really wasn't that good, but that didn't matter to us because we just think like, yeah, bad English that's it. Right? There aren't any other languages besides bad English, right? I mean, as far as we're concerned. And so, I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not, right? We think bad English is all there is. And so if somebody gives us Texas secession in bad English, we'll go for it. Tennessee GOP. Tennessee GOP was a Twitter site which pretended to be the Twitter site of the Tennessee Republican Party. It wasn't. It was a Russian site. It had more followers than the actual Tennessee Republican Party. And it proposed that Barack Obama was born in Africa, that Hillary Clinton was a pedophile pimp. It was followed by Michael Flynn. It was followed by Kellyanne Conway. Michael Flynn was retweeting stuff actually, Michael Flynn is a kind of special case. He was retweeting Russian material from 12 different Russian sites right down to the day before the election, right? Now, my point is that if you don't realize that there are other countries, if you just think that like English is just the thing, it doesn't even occur to you that this might be happening. One of the reasons why Russia can carry out offensive cyber operations against the US is they have 1 million people who speak bad English. Do we have 1 million people who speak bad Russian, who are not actual Russian immigrants, right? No. Do we have 1 million people who speak bad Arabic or bad Farsi or whatever it might be? We don't. We don't have that. And I mean, so I'm not even getting to your question about the humanities. I'm still at the level of national security. Right? The fact that the world speaks your language in the age of the internet ain't necessarily such a good thing, especially if you've lost the facility of learning their languages so you can figure out what they're doing, right? How many young people are competent who are not of Russia or Soviet origin, know both Russian and can code, right? There are tons of those people, but the entire cyber war between the US and Russia is being fought by Russians on both sides. On both sides, right? It's all Russians against Russians. That's because we can't. Okay, so okay, I'm saying it now, but yes, I mean, so you know where I'm going to stand about the humanities. I just want to say something different. If you learn a foreign language so that you can go out and do something interesting, but you also learn a foreign language so you have some chance of understanding yourself. If you really get into some foreign culture by actually learning the language, that means you have some chance of getting distance on yourself and being much more interesting about yourself. So, I mean, I think one of the reasons why we're in such a bad position in terms of security is that we've lost language expertise. But also one of the reasons why we're not doing a very good job of making the distinction between the rest of the world and us, and making distinctions between the America we want to be and the America that is that we don't have languages. So, I'm with you. Thank you.
We have, I know people are waiting. We also have lots of questions from the other room. I am sorry we won't be able to cover everybody's questions. I just want to read one more that came from the other room, and that's about the students that are currently protesting for stricter gun laws. And they would like you to comment on your thoughts about the possible success of this movement, given the institutions that are built, that exist against them.
Right, right. So, I mean, I'm going to comment on that. I can't answer, finally whether it's going to work or not. But there's some things that are interesting about that. The first is the factuality question. So it seems like a school shooting would be a very elementary question. It happened, it didn't happen. And there are very strong forces, out there in the world or in the cyber world, which say that it didn't happen. And a lot of those forces are Russian bots, by the way, but say that it didn't happen, that it was a false flag operation, that these kids are crisis actors and so on. And, the Russian robots push that, but not only Russian bots. And then you find Americans saying it, in the real world. And so part of the important thing about school shootings is the sheer facticity of them. That here you have actual human beings like you and me who in this horribly grotesque way die in precisely the places that should be the safest. I mean, to have a government is to have control of violence, and to have your schools shot up is to show that you don't have a government. And so the sheer factuality of it is one thing, but the thing about the facts is one of the points I was trying to make. They don't live and die on their own, right? If they did, we'd be in a very different world. The facts don't make it on their own. The facts need support, and that's what the students from Parkland have done such a good job of, is that they've taken the risk of putting themselves in public and saying, here I am, a person, right? But they've also been extremely articulate in the way they've used the English language to describe their predicament, because the facts can't make it on their own. Even the basic facts like school shootings can't make it on their own. They need advocates. So I think they've got a good shot because they've done those things, and then there's also the fact of public marching. A lot is up against them, but I think they've got a really good chance. And the reason I think they have a really good chance is that they seem to understand what it is they're up against, and they seem to be willing to identify themselves, with the most basic facts of the situation, like the human being and the fact lining up together, using the culture to get the human being and the fact to line up together. They've done that very beautifully.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each one of you just to state your question very briefly, if you can. So I'm going to ask Professor Snyder to kind of respond to as many of them as he can in this short time that we have. I want to give each one of you a chance to express your thoughts. Please, go ahead.
So I kind of want to go back to what you said about how apathy should be considered uncool now.
Yeah.
I think that I'd argue that today it's more difficult to be resistant of apathy, mainly due to the internet and just the influx of constant stimulation.
Yeah.
But that being said, I know you said it's kind of up to the youth to resist this and make the resistance to apathy seem cool, but I kind of want to push that back on you and just see if you have any suggestions.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I do, but I'm supposed to take all these questions, so I'm gonna answer you.
Okay.
Okay, I will. Yes, I do. And it's that. So, first of all, you've already answered part of it, which is that we choose to use the internet the way that we do. You're absolutely right. Like, the stimulation of it means that we're all overstimulated, and it's hard to take a stand. But you guys are better than we are at using the internet in different ways, if you want to, right? But the second thing is the valorization of people in the real world, like actual investigative reporters. I mean, for me, and I say this entirely without irony, those people are heroes. I mean, and some of my best friends, some people I care about and respect the most, are people in their 20s who are in Kurdistan now, or in the Donbass right now, and are reporting, right? Not everyone has to do that, not everyone can do that, but to respect that and to recognize that and to say, okay, that's a model that maybe I could do at a smaller level, I think that would help a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you sort of just touched on it for a second there, but I was going to ask, since there are good ways to use the internet for our democracy and that don't lull us into complacency, do you...
all the time. It was that there was a specific purpose, and the reason why you had the specific purpose was that there was no standing army. Once you have a standing army, that whole rationale changes. So, I mean, the Second Amendment seems to be seriously fetishized in this country and misunderstood. And the very people who say they're strict constructionists and want to go back to the original meaning don't seem to get the original meaning at all. That's what I think about the Second Amendment. But, okay. Oh, yeah, I had other stuff. So the regime question, where's the regime question? So I think of our country as being in a kind of mixed position where there are many things that are profoundly imperfect about it, which can be repaired. I don't think about the whole regime as being something that one would want to stand aside from. I know that there are places like that, right? Like I work on people in Eastern Europe in the 1970s who took the kind of stand that you're talking about, and which they called anti-politics, and which had a certain functionality as well as moral coherence. I don't think the United States is at that point where not voting is meaningful. I think not voting in Czechoslovakia in 1977 was meaningful. I think not voting in the U.S. is a bad choice now because our votes still matter. They don't matter as much as they should, but if we don't vote, they're going to keep mattering less. That's how I would describe the moment. So I'm just gonna stay with the voting example because it seems to me to be the central one. What was the other question that I forgot?
Religion, I think.
Oh, organized religion. Very briefly, I think the problem here. Where is my organized religion friend? I think very briefly the problem is I'm not going to hit on any particular religion or denomination or evangelical or not. I think that the problem is leader cults, like the idea that life is really about a leader. I think that's the problem. Like the simplification of politics so there are no institutions and no laws, but you just imagine that one person is going to save you one way or the other. I think that's where religion, organized or disorganized, I mean, most American religion, frankly, is pretty disorganized. But religion, organized or disorganized, can get you into a kind of leader myth. And that's not how our Constitution is supposed to work. We don't have leaders. We have presidents and elected representatives, but we don't actually have leaders. When you think this person could be the one who saves us, right? That everything's corrupt, but this person could save us. That's a way of thinking which I think is not appropriate to this world. Okay.
So before I close this, there's one more. It's actually a request from the other room. This person says, tomorrow is my 26th birthday. Can I have a signed book, please? And they say that they have an ID for proof. Now, I don't have the name, but I'm hoping that they will make themselves known to you.
Yeah.
And then you will see.
I'm going to be, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna go outside, and if you've just turned 26, or even if you haven't just turned 26, I will happily sign your book.